Yes. Now, what I'm going to try and impress on you is that science is absolutely immersed in philosophy. It used to be called natural philosophy. The word science only started to be used in this technical meaning. It just means knowledge in about 1830. And in fact, we've lost track, particularly in the last 50 years, of the philosophical basis for which any investigation into nature has to take place. A very great English philosopher, I think one of the greatest philosophers of the last 100 and something years, A.N. Whitehead, who partnered Russell in writing the Principia Mathematica in 1911. Whitehead was a mathematician and a physicist, and he said that, like all family quarrels, the falling out of science and philosophy has been a disaster for both parties. And I think the word disaster is not too big a claim. What I'm going to talk about is this poisonous topic, the difference between the two brain hemispheres. When I was growing up, there were all kinds of jazzy ideas about what this difference was, that the left hemisphere sort of did reason and language, and the right hemisphere did emotion, and, was given to painting pretty pictures. But this is wrong. We soon discovered that both hemispheres were involved in everything. But we'd asked the wrong question of the brain, assuming it, very importantly, assuming it to be a machine rather than part of a person. We'd asked not how does this part of the brain approach the world, but what is it does, like a photocopier. But the brain is not like that. The brain is how our experience comes into being. I don't necessarily, and I'm not going to address now the question whether consciousness exists apart from the brain. I believe it does. I don't believe the brain actually emits consciousness, but if you like, permits consciousness. But I'm not going to try and go there today. For those of you who are interested, I've written very long books on all of this, which I tell you about later. But there's an observation which goes back many, many years, which is, you find it well summed up by Blaise Pascal in the Pensée, I think 417 in the Brunswick numeration. The duplicity or the twofold nature of man is so marked that people have believed that we perhaps have two souls. And remarks like this are also to be found in Spinoza, in Kant, in Goethe, in Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, in Bergson, and in a very great German philosopher, not well known outside of Germany, Max Scheler, who of course was a brilliant phenomenological philosopher who died too young, and at his grave, Wittgenstein delivered the oration and said that he was the most brilliant philosopher of his age in Europe. So there's a perception there, and it's not just confined to Western philosophers. I have been reading the anthropology, the mythology of cultures from China, Japan, India, North American native people. And in all these cultures, there is this idea that there's two kinds of aspects to our experience. In fact, the Navajo say that there are two kinds of eyes with which you look at the world. One is to get things, and the other is to appreciate the whole, which you will discover in a moment is extremely important. So if you are skeptical about the idea that there are important differences between the two brain hemispheres, I can answer in various ways, but I prefer to ask you a few questions. Why is the brain divided? I was never, this was not addressed in medical school. It was just assumed the brain is divided. It has this body of fibers at the base called the corpus callosum, but actually only 2% of fibers cross the corpus callosum. And if the computing power of this machine, the brain, is in connections, why is it severed? And it's not just our brains, all brains that we've looked at, birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, when you get down to the neural networks of insects, the most ancient surviving creature, Nematostella vectensis, 700 million years old, and described by, I think, Thomas Bechstein, who discovered it at Heidelberg. I hope I've got the name right. He says, this is the origin of the mammalian brain, and it is already asymmetrical. Why? So the first question is, why is it divided? The second is, why is it asymmetrical? I can't show you this, but actually the brain is much larger at the front on the right than on the left, something that was never mentioned in medical school. It's the biggest asymmetry in the brain. What we were told about was that the brain is bigger on the left posteriorly because, of course, in those days, the left hemisphere did everything. And the right hemisphere was really just there to prop up the left hemisphere and stop it falling over. But we've got beyond that. And in fact, the right hemisphere is very important, as I'll try to explain. But in any case, the brain is asymmetrical. Why? Because the skull isn't in the same way, and the world around us is on all sides. And the third question is, this band of fibers, the corpus callosum, it only started with mammals. All the others don't have a connection, or they have very tenuous, exiguous connections, very narrow connections. But the corpus callosum, as such, only started with mammals. And it's got smaller over evolution, not larger. And thirdly, its principal function is inhibition. The brains of the apes have more inhibitory neurons than any other mammals. The brains of humans have more inhibitory neurons and more types of inhibitory neurons than any of the apes. The great advance in the human brain is inhibition. Many of the neurons that cross the corpus callosum are glutamatergic. They are, in other words, positive in their effect, if you like. They're transmitting and facilitating, but they, more often than not, abut on GABAergic neurons, which, of course, are inhibitory. So why is all this? And why is this band of fibers actually getting smaller in relation to the size of the brain? I think the answer is that our brains are becoming more and more specialized in a certain way. And this has an ancient origin. You may well think, what is all this asymmetry about? Well, the answer is really quite simple, I believe. And nobody else has suggested that any other thesis explains more of the data than this thesis. All creatures have to do two things at once which are incompatible. They have to be able to focus extremely precisely on a tiny detail in order to grab it, pick it up, and use it. Food, a twig to build a nest, whatever it is, they've got to be exact, they've got to know exactly what they're looking for, and they've got to be quick and precise in doing it. But if that's the only attention they pay, they will not survive, because at the same time, they have to be looking out for predators, for their conspecifics, for their mate, for their offspring, that they need to look after. And so, as one center of awareness cannot do these two things at once, we need two. We can, you may say, you've done an exercise in yoga, which I recommend, which is both simultaneously having the broadest possible, open, unjudgmental attention to the whole, and at the same time focusing on a detail. But that's because we have two hemispheres. What I'm interested in is how this affects reality. I mean, this is a really important point. Attention is central to whatever it is that we know as the world we experience. And that's all that we will ever know as the world we experience. It comes into being for us as a product of the way in which attention is paid to the world. And I sometimes give an example of this, which is, I live in a house that is at the bottom of a huge mountain, which can be seen from the sea. This is in Scotland. And its name in Norse, which has become naturalized in Scottish, means the sloping rock. Why? Because this mountain was a landmark for the Viking people coming down there that signified very dangerous bay where they were likely to be shipwrecked. We know also from the fact that the Picts, we have their dwellings, the Picts were living there before the Vikings. For them, this mountain was the home of the gods. When people came in the 18th century to visit Scotland, they came with their sketchbooks and they drew this mountain for its beautiful texture of many colors and its form. When people came in the 19th century, they were inspired by geology, and it just happens to be an extraordinarily good example of columnar basalt formation. To a physicist, it's 99.99% space of some kind, and the other 0.01%, we don't really know what it is. So which of these is the real mountain? My answer is you can't say any one of them is the real mountain. They're all real ways of appreciating the mountain that come as a product of experience. If you look at an organism as if it were a mechanism, you will find all the bits in that organism that respond to this model. As they say in English, you probably have the same saying, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And this is the problem, that when you look in a certain way, you see only certain things. And that confirms that the way you're looking is good. So you pay more of that kind of attention in future. And so you get tighter and tighter into a spiral that is hard to break out of, in which where you start, believing, for example, that we're dealing only with mechanisms, leads to only mechanical thinking, which misses 9/10 of the picture. So this is why it's interesting. What are the differences that occur phenomenologically to someone using their left hemisphere or their right hemisphere? Now, it's quite true that all the time we're using both, from moment to moment. There is a meta-control center in the tegmentum of the midbrain, which we think is part of the mechanism that directs attention to one or other hemisphere, but it's constantly changing. But I'm not really talking about that. What I'm talking about ultimately is what happens to an individual or a culture when they either can't or no longer wish to attend to one sort of vision of the world. So on the one hand, you've got the left hemisphere's attention, which produces discrete items, separate, isolated fragments. And these are known because it's looking for what it wants. It's looking for something familiar, food, twig, whatever. The rest it doesn't see. So it's looking for isolated things that are known, that are static. So, for example, when people have damage to the right hemisphere, the normal flow in which you see the world is broken up, and you see a hand moving like I'm old enough to remember something called cinefilm. I'm sure none of you here have ever heard of it. But it used to get stuck sometimes, and you get this effect. You could describe it as like stop-go animation. So, because it's fixing something all the time to get it, what it sees is decontextualized, and that is extraordinarily important, because context changes everything. It changes the meaning of everything you look at. If you want to understand the heart, you have to look at it in the body where it is situated. If you cut it out and put it on the lab bench, you're not in a better position to understand it. Context can completely change the meaning of a word. Let me give you an example. In America, there are 4 sizes of cereal packets. There's jumbo, which means very large. And there's economy, which means large. And then there's family, which means medium. And finally, there's large, which means small. So context changes the meaning of everything. One big context that gets omitted is embodiment. So the left hemisphere abstracts information and then categorizes it. So in this process, embodiment and context have been lost, but also the particularity, the unique quality of this thing, because it's treated only as an exemplar of a category. And so it's constantly categorizing the unique, disembodying the embodied. And this process tends towards deanimation. And you can experimentally, using TMS, you can knock out one hemisphere at a time. With the left hemisphere, what one normally sees as animate is seen more mechanically. And with the right hemisphere in action and the left hemisphere knocked out, then the world appears more animate. So the sun seems like a living being that is crossing the sky. The left hemisphere is more interested in quantity, the right hemisphere in quality. And perhaps the most important difference is that The left hemisphere sees only representations. Now, what is a representation? A representation, as the word suggests, is a presence after the fact, when it's no longer actually present, represented. But there is such a thing as something presencing to us. In German, Heidegger uses the term Anwesen, to presence. And he actually had to invent the verb from the noun Anwesen. But in English, we have adopted this idea of presencing, which is that something comes into being between you and the world. Now, this is not just a figure of speech in my belief. I believe that anything exists only in a relationship, and that relationship is between the perceiving consciousness and the other consciousness that is generating this, whatever it is that we do perceive. I'm not saying we make it all up. That's a kind of ghastly postmodernism that I reject. It's negative and nihilistic. Of course there's a reality. But it's not just out there in some naive, realistic way, like it's something that we receive like on a photographic plate or on a recorder or something. We take part in its becoming what it is. I've suggested already attention, and the nature of attention makes a difference. So, what are these two worlds phenomenologically like? You could say that of the left hemisphere is one in which what we take for reality is in fact a representation, something like a map, a theory, a diagram. All these things are fine, but they're very thin compared with the complexity of reality. And their value lies in that. A map is useful in as much as it leaves almost everything in the world out. If it had more information in it, we couldn't use it. It's one that's made of isolated things. I believe, actually, that there are no things. I haven't got time to go into this, but that the fundamental nature of existence is in relations, and that relations are prior to what we call relata, the things that we perceive. And these things, moreover, are known, familiar, predetermined, fixed, made up of bits, fragments that are decontextualized, disembodied, and have no meaning or coherence until we give it to them. Where all is abstract, generic in nature, infinitely reproducible, quantifiable, and inanimate, and the future is a fantasy in which things can only get better for being under our control. Because the raison d'etre of the left hemisphere is to apprehend, grasp, apprehendere, grasp onto stuff. It doesn't comprehend, which is to begreifen, to hold together. It angreift rather than begreift. And so we've got this distinction in the way the two hemispheres work. On the other hand, in the world of the right hemisphere, nothing is finally certain or entirely predictable, but replete with possibility and order, one in which all is not isolated, but ultimately connected to everything else, is not fixed, but flowing, where what exists are wholes, and the parts are, if you like, an artifact of the left hemisphere's tendency to split everything up. Most of the meaning not only is, but has to remain implicit in this world if it's not to be traduced, if it's not to be totally misrepresented. Where it's a world where no two anythings are ever the same, but unequal and asymmetric, being always, like each blade of grass, unique, where quality matters at least as much as, if not more than, quantity, a world that is essentially animate and whose projected future is a product of realism, not denial. A little comment on denial. The left hemisphere is grossly optimistic. It thinks it understands everything. It thinks it's in control. As you know, the intelligent person knows how much they don't know and therefore is aware of this, but a really stupid person thinks they know everything because they don't know what it is they don't know. This is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It can be seen all around you. The left hemisphere doesn't know very much, but because of that, it thinks, we've got it, we know everything. Just one more experiment, we'll have it all sorted out and under our control. This is not reality. Let me give you an example from neurology. A person comes in the night with a left hemisphere stroke, they have a right paralyzed arm, and they're all too aware of it, and they're rather sad. And they say, well, what can I do with this? They come in with a right hemisphere stroke and a paralyzed left arm. You go to see them in the morning and say, how are you? Very well, thank you. Oh, well, that's good. Any problems anywhere, like moving anything? No. Moving your left arm, for example? No, fine. Well, could you move it then? There. And nothing actually moves. And if you bring it round in front of them and say, there, move that, they say, oh, that's not my arm, that belongs to that man over there, or you, doctor. But they don't, it is deep in denial. In fact, V.S. Ramachandran, you probably know the name, he's a very distinguished neuroscientist, says that without this guiding, reality-centered right hemisphere, the left hemisphere is prone to delusions. And I have examined it at enormous length, and it's in the part 1 of The Matter with Things, my latest book. The delusions and misperceptions that occur following and connected to brain injury, and practically all of the really amazing delusions and hallucinations occur after damage to the right hemisphere rather than the left. And indeed in schizophrenia, which is a condition, of course, very familiar to all of you, in which often are prominent delusions and hallucinations, they appear to show all the signs of right hemisphere hypofunction and the left hemisphere having gone into overdrive to account for things. You know, in English, we used to say that mad people had lost their reason. But it's been pointed out, first of all, by Eugene Mankowski, the Franco-Polish psychiatrist, a brilliant man and a brilliant philosopher, but then by the English writer G.K. Chesterton, that what happens in madness is that the person loses everything but their reason. So they've got only their reason to try and work everything out. No common sense, no view of what is probable or possible here. So the two important things I want you to take away is that one world is like a map, a representation, the other like the complex and beautiful world. One is inanimate and the other animate, broadly speaking. I haven't got time to go into all the detail. There's 2,000 pages for you to examine if you really want to know all the detail. And in my latest book, I refer to 5,600 papers from the literature. There is a kind of, what's it called, urban myth, that the thing about hemisphere difference is all exploded. If you talk to somebody ignorant, they'll say, oh, no, that's all rubbish. I mean, that was all exploded years ago. But actually, in the meantime, scientists have been doing what scientists should do, which is not be carried away by a dogma, but actually look. And what they found is masses of evidence of the difference between these two hemispheres. I'm the lucky person who was able to make sense of the picture. Now, most of this is laid out in a book called The Master and His Emissary, which came out in 2009, published by Yale University Press, and it sold over 200,000 copies. But I have written a much more interesting, I believe, book that takes it further and looks at the whole constitution of the cosmos. So first of all, I'm looking at neuropsychology, how we appreciate anything. Then the second part of the book is epistemology, how do we say we ever get to know something? And I suggest that in the first part of the book, I show that in all the important ways of getting hold of a reality, the left hemisphere is inferior, demonstrably inferior, less veridical than the right. In the second part of the book, I show that it's not good enough to use just science or just imagination or just reason or just intuition. We actually need to use all four of these wherever possible. And interestingly, in each case, particularly clearly in maths and science, the great discoveries were made by right hemisphere function. I can say that because they come suddenly as a gestalt, with an apparent aha moment, a revelation, and this has been robustly connected with the right superior temporal sulcus and gyrus. I give many examples in the book from scientists and mathematicians. But what I also do in the second part of the book is to look through Western history at the big turning points in the history of ideas. So I start off with the Greeks and the Romans, I come forward to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment for Erklären, I don't know, the Industrial Revolution, Romanticism, Modernism, and Postmodernism. So there we are. And what I suggest at the end is that we live in a world in which we are not being guided by what our right hemisphere would tell us. There is actually a war on attending to the body, attending to intuition, attending to experience. These have all been devalued because apparently a machine will be better at all these things. As we move more and more, month by month, never mind year by year, into a world dominated by bureaucratic thinking and its physical counterpart, which is vastly complicated systems of AI, the world becomes less and less like a human world and less like one that really understands what a human being is, what the world is, and what we're doing here. I don't think we've the faintest idea anymore. And this is not because something terrible has happened to the right hemisphere. It's because in a culture which is publicly self-analytic, and there is a public discourse which relies on a sort of process of rationalizing, all the sources of immediate information about the world that we used to have been ruled out. Number one was the natural world, which tells you there's more here than we can really understand is going on and why. But, until 150 years ago, most people in the world lived in intimate contact with the natural world. Now it may be only half or not that. Then there is culture. We're now supposed to reject and disparage our own culture at any rate, and reject a tradition, because a tradition means fossilization. But excuse me, a tradition doesn't. A tradition is a living thing like a plant. It grows, and it can be made to grow better. But you won't improve. If you want a plant to go off a wall here, the answer is not to pull it out and stick it on the wall, because it'll die. You train it. A gardener knows this. And a tradition is a living thing. Look at the last few hundred years, how that tradition has changed every decade, practically. So it's a major problem. We've thrown away the wisdom of our ancestors. We're also, I think, in the process of throwing away, or we have been in the 20th century, we've made art too conceptual, too intellectual, and not visceral enough, so that a painting shouldn't need to be explained to you by a long screed on the wall. It's not a thought, it's a being. And you are in contact with this being as you are with your friend. And it speaks to you or it doesn't. If it's lost that power, it's lost one of the ways in which we can be told that the world is not explicitly calculable, explicitly explicable. And I think also religion has been either turned into something fundamentalist, which is the left hemisphere's idea. It's all in a book. It's all completely true. This is the truth. I have it. You're wrong. This black and white thinking, and particularly this I'm right thinking, is very typical of the left hemisphere. You can see it in patients who have right hemisphere damage. Or religion has been presented as a kind of childish fantasy. Only somebody very simple, not very well educated, would believe in it. I think that's a massive error. It just means that our minds are no longer subtle enough to understand what the foundations of this thinking were. And I have a long chapter in the latest book called The Sense of the Sacred, in which I try to convey why this thing is hardly turnable into words, but nonetheless for that, in fact, because of that, it is inexpressible. It is of central importance. So if you like to think about it, it's not a way of thinking is that it's not so much that the brain has changed, but how we use it. If, for example, you buy a radio set, and to begin with you listen to a couple of programs that you like, and after a while you only listen to one. What's happened is you have changed, the set hasn't changed, it's all there. We've got the capacity, we're just not using it. Now, I'm going to wrap up at that point. There's very, very much more, obviously, that could be said. Perhaps I'll just mention that having, as it were, I think made progress in philosophy, if that's not a rash claim, by showing that we can see when two competing philosophical schools differ on something, we have something to guide us. I have a whole chapter on paradox, which takes in all the paradoxes that, well, not all, about 30-something of the paradoxes that are familiar to philosophers. And what I think I can show is that the paradox comes about because of a clash between the way the left hemisphere views it and the right hemisphere views it. And as I've suggested to you, in the first part of the book, I can show that the left hemisphere is on its own deluded. And it's not just me that says that. There are a number of neurologists, distinguished ones, that I quote in the book. It is deluded when it's left to itself. It needs that correction. And if that is visible in the thinking, and we know that this point of view depends on having taken a left hemisphere point of view, and the opposite point of view depends on taking a more right hemisphere point of view, we know perhaps which one to pay attention to first. Let me put it no stronger than that. You all know the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise, I suppose. Anyway, Achilles was famously swift of foot, and the tortoise said, "I can beat you in a race any time you like." So Achilles said, "Well, no." And he said, "Yes, I can prove it." So Achilles, being a kind of generous-spirited man, gave the tortoise a head start. And the problem is this: the right hemisphere knows that in 2 strides, Achilles will have overtaken the tortoise. But the left hemisphere calculates like this: before Achilles can get anywhere, he's got to get at least to the place where the tortoise started from. And by that time, the tortoise has moved on. So now he's got to get to the place where the tortoise now is. But by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved on. This is an infinite series. He can never accomplish an infinite series. Well, this is just obviously wrong, but I'm not going to give you the other 34 cases, but there is this interest in it. If you find that there is a way which is breaking up something that is indivisible, that is retrospecting on something when completed rather than following the process through in a more process philosophical kind, I belong in the tradition of people like William James, Henri Bergson, A.N. Whitehead, who believed that process was more important than stasis. Then there is some progress. Then in part 2, as I say, epistemology, what do we find when we look at the different modes of understanding? We need them all, not just 1 or 2, not enough just to bring science to bear, for example, or just your imagination. You need to bring to bear and balance the 4 of science, reason, intuition, and imagination. And in the last part of the book, it's basically a kind of cosmology or metaphysics. I'm saying, given what we now know, when we look at the world, what is its structure? And what do we find there that we can not finally say this is the case, because that could never happen, but say this is more likely to be fruitful. And I look, first of all, at the coincidence of opposites, which is something we've completely forgotten about, but is an ancient truth, which is in all the great philosophical traditions, East and West. And I show how that plays out in the world, and how the delusion that it is not the case leads to us thinking that if something is quite simply good, like this in this context, more and more and more and more of it is better and better and better and better. But however, a thing and its opposite are curiously related, so that most of the cases in which we've cast off tyranny and sought freedom have ended in tyranny quite quickly, for example. And then I look at the one and the many, and then I look at time, space, matter, consciousness, purpose, value, which I believe is an intrinsic part of consciousness and behind and beyond the beginnings of life. And finally, the sense of the sacred. So if you want a comprehensive person's philosophy drawn on neurology, to a certain extent physics, but mainly philosophy, some critical philosophy, I hope, there it is. Now, what we're here for is to talk about the business of the way in which we approach research. And so I put forward, and I would have had a slide of this, but I can repeat them at any time, my suggestions of things we might learn from this. One is the importance of how we attend to something. If I attend to a body as if it is completely alien to me and simply a machine, the closest one comes to in clinical life is when the body is on the mortuary table and the pathologist is cutting it up. But a body is many things more than that. It is the body that is expressed by Michelangelo, by Leonardo. It is the body of your lover. It is the body of your patient. All of these require distinctly different attention. And if you don't get that distinction right, you'll end up in big trouble. The next thing is that the narrow view, and we live in a world which is ever more specialized, needs to be balanced with the whole picture. At least you need to know something about it. And I don't believe that anyone should go into research in the life sciences, certainly not become a doctor, unless they've done at least a year of philosophy. And I think in America, there's something like that. They don't specify philosophy, but you have to have a first degree. And I think the reason for that is that you don't know what a human being is if you naively assume it is some kind of a very complicated machine. And that may seem obvious. To say that to one's unthinking colleagues, they feel a bit hurt. Of course it's a machine. What do you mean? But actually, it is not a machine. And no philosopher would just go, of course it's a machine. It is one very, very narrow view. And it gives rise to the reductive materialism that now sits on science. Curiously enough, mainly on the life sciences. Physicists gave up on it 100 years ago. They realized that the world is enmeshed with consciousness, and actually the act of observation changes what is observed, that things don't follow mechanical rules, that the universe is not Newtonian at all, but is a complex thing, bundle of relations, which is constantly in motion and change. Then there is the fact that the change in the context, in the least, changes what it is that you're looking at. And I gave you an amusing example, but that's really to say there are much more profound examples. If you explain a joke, it falls flat. If you paraphrase a poem in prose, it no longer works. It doesn't have any power anymore because you've decontextualized those words from the context of the body of the poem, speaking to you as another embodied individual. Then there is the philosophical narrow-mindedness, which I think I've touched on, mechanisms and beyond that. Another is that not all that is real is quantifiable. You know, there's a kind of terribly naive vision that if it's not measurable in the lab and you can't see it, it can't exist. Okay, who in this room has never experienced love? Good. You all know what I mean then. Is love real? Yes, I think so. Can it be measured? Can it be seen? Can you do anything with it to manipulate it? Absolutely not. There is also a refusal to look through the telescope. You know the story of the philosopher who said he didn't need to look through Galileo's telescope, in which he had visualized the moon's mountains, so the mountains on the moon. And the philosopher said, I don't even need to look through your telescope because Aristotle has already proved that the moon must be a perfect sphere. Well, it's the descendants of that philosopher that I find myself dealing with all the time. People who don't even need to do what a proper scientist does, which is look at the evidence, but just know that there can't be anything in this. Ha, ha, ha. So I think we ought to be a bit careful about not being scientific enough, not being reasonable enough, being too rationalistic, which is not the same thing. Reason is a combination of experience with the ability to think logically. And then there's another laboratory outside the laboratory in this building, and it's the laboratory of life. And here's a fascinating thing. So I won't mention his name to spare him the embarrassment, but a famous neurologist, not really a neurologist, he's not a doctor at all, he's a neuropsychologist. Actually, I find that this is an interesting thing, that neurologists, psychiatrists, people who have experience with people, understand everything I say, and they flock to my door. Neuroscientists who have only ever dealt with a centrifuge and a pipette, or a sort of whatever it is, then think, but this isn't right. How can this neuroscience relate to people? can brains really have anything to do with real people? And that is where we've got to, my friends. We don't think what it is we're dealing with. And I think my last point is also my first, that science is inseparable from philosophy and the humanities, which teach us so much. The literature, the history, the poetry, the music, the drama, the rituals that people have used to embody wisdom that can't be written down in the same way it's written down in a manual for your lawnmower. So that's where we're at. Thank you very much.